The Westpenra Papers, the second level of learning. Exopolitics Paper Number 3, The Great Galactic Wars by Westpenra, Friday, July 20, 2012, http://westpenry.com. Part 2. 8. The Sirian-Orion War. Becoming a peaceful star race themselves didn't make all other star races in the galaxy peaceful, of course. This was something the Queen was soon to discover firsthand. There were always species attacking Orion from one flank or another in efforts to weaken the vast empire. This never worked, however. Orion was too strong. The Queen normally managed to calm the invaders down and either have them to leave, or started recruiting them for the empire if they showed they could their ways. Some of them, when they saw the benefits, actually did, while others backed off. On rare occasion, Orion had to defend themselves, but the invaders soon realized that they didn't stand a chance. Dream of their surprise when all of a sudden a wolf and reptilian dwarf race hit their empire from southwest. Never before had the tall Aryans seen anything like it. They, who called themselves the Sirian overlords, were the height of a human, 10-year-old, but they were stocky, vicious-looking, fast and extremely strong. They looked wolf-cat-like, but with a reptilian horn bone across their foreheads. It was said that the more prominent the horn, the more powerful the being was. Many of them also wore helmets with horns on them. And the weirdest of it all, they came in hollowed-out planets. This way, they took the outer flanks of Orion with surprise and quickly came closer and closer to Peshmetan, the Queen's own Sector 9, Star Lane. 8.1 The first attacks on the Orion Empire. Soon enough, however, when the Sirian overlords had fought a few battles, they realized that they had encountered what they thought was an equal enemy, and they finally got some resistance. The Wolven lords had learned how to navigate the nano-world with hollowed-out asteroids and planets, and these warships made an excellent shelter and a deadly weapon. An armada of hollowed-out planets could suddenly appear out of nowhere in 4 space/time, taking everybody by surprise. Then they hit without mercy, making full use of their deadly weapons. The Sirians didn't hesitate. They attacked Orion with full force, despite the warnings from the Orion guards. The battles were furious and bloody. For the first time, the Sirians felt that they fought for their lives against an enemy that could meet their capacity. It didn't take them long, however, to realize that not only did the Orions meet their capacity, but by far exceeded it. They couldn't believe it. Someone could actually threaten the feared Canis lords? The Aryans' warning didn't go over well with the Sirians, so they had to taste the power of the Orion Empire. The Aryans destroyed hollowed-out planet after planet, totally terminating all life and making it into stardust, floating around in space like grains of sand. Very few Sirians survived the Aryan counterattacks. The Sirians withdrew and licked their wounds. The King of Kings from Canis Major, the Lord Canis Connor, was baffled and absolutely furious. He couldn't believe how easily his people were defeated. With his armor still on, he furiously sat himself down on his throne and breathed heavily through his teeth, making it sound like a tornado. He needed to change strategies, determined not to give up. Contrary to his method not to take any prisoners, but to kill all enemies and eat the wounded alive, he had decided to make an exception. He had ordered his men to take a few prisoners of war, whom he intended to interrogate and torture. But there was one thing that was even worse than being defeated, something he couldn't get over, and something that embarrassed him to the 10th degree. Many of the best of the Orion warriors were females. And the rulers of the Orion Empire were females as well. In his world, females were always in the background, standing behind the men, following every move they made. They were inferior and couldn't stand up to the males, and would not be allowed to. In SIRIUS and in Alpha Draconis, one of their most important colony, and on any conquered world, the male dominated the female. The Sirian people were sexual beings, and sex was basically what the male used the female for sex and as servants. The women on the Sirian worlds were breeding machines, and the males wanted strong offspring that could defend and strengthen their bloodline so that they got status and power over others. Don't mess with my family, or... It was man eat man, or more accurately, wolf eat wolf, and a pure survival instinct. Sometimes, when the wars of conquest were raging on each flank, women could be called in for military service as well and went to war under the patriarchal regime. In his palace back in SIRIUS, the Canis Conor, the foremost king of kings, sat on his throne for hours and hours, too furious to do anything except delegating orders, deciding who was going to be punished and who was not. Finally, he stood up from his throne with a deadly and crazy look in his eyes. He called in his guards. "Take me to the dungeon. Show me the prisoners of war. Show me the trophies," he shouted. The guards immediately escorted the King of Kings to the palace dungeon. It was a very wet and cold place, lit up by a dim electronic light coming out directly from the stone walls. The palace was built on the top of a mountain, but the dungeon was underground and carved out directly from the hard mountain stone with the help of laser technology. It was a very depressing place and exclusively housed enemies of the state, where they sat waiting to be executed, a big event which usually drew thousands and thousands of people to watch, especially as the execution was going to be overseen by the King of Kings himself. Now, however, the dungeon was empty, except for these prisoners of war. He'd spared them because he needed to know more about this disgusting star race who dared to challenge the Canis Conor. On their way down to the dungeons, a royal interrogator had been picked up, carrying the key to the locker room where his torture arsenal was located, which was outside the thick, heavy door that led to the steps, which continued down to the dungeon cells. Just in case, the royal interrogator brought his most effective equipment down with him. The Canis Conor, his guards, and the interrogator eventually stopped outside a big dungeon and stared into the faded light inside. The king could see 3 prisoners in there, and they seemed to be in quite miserable shape. One of them seemed badly wounded, perhaps already dying, the other one sat quietly staring into the wall, while the third, who was a female reptilian, met the king's eyes without blinking. The King of Kings found himself staring back into these black, ultra-deep eyes while a strange sensation came to his head. He felt like these non-blinking eyes took him right through the dimensions and into the great Khaa, the great void, which the king had traveled so many times, but always had respect for, and feared at the same time. So also now. It was something with these eyes and this look that scared the hell out of him. He, the great Canis Conor, was frightened. It made him furious again, too ashamed to admit his weakness in front of his people. All of the sudden his fear deepened and he found himself mesmerized by those space black eyes. He didn't know if it was in his imagination, but almost like a snake, the head of the female reptile started moving from left to right to left, and then in circles. The Syrian king noticed he lost control over both his body and his mind, and all he could do was to lean forward, towards the bars, slowly closing in on his strange prisoner. This all occurred in a few seconds' time, but it felt like he was in trance for an eternity. Then everything happened in the blink of an eye. One of the guards ran into the king and violently pushed him aside. This took him out of his trance in an instant and he grabbed for his evaporator, a gun-like weapon that could fry a diamond in a second. But the rest happened before the king even had the chance to interfere. Suddenly a hissing sound was heard, like ATT. The reptilian female spat like a cobra right in the face of the guard who had pushed the king out of target. The guard cried out in agony for half a second and fell dead or paralyzed to the floor. At the same time, a second guard had used his evaporator on the prisoner and killed her. The King of Kings was in shock and just stared with his eyes open at the dead black body on the floor, paying no attention to the guard beside him, who now certainly was dead. The remaining crew, happy to be alive, retreated quickly, out of target from the other 2 prisoners, and stared at each other. What the hell was that? The king cried out. The guard who had killed the female stepped forward, bowing deeply before his king before he spoke. "I saw it, my King of Kings, I saw it," he said. This being seemed to hypnotize you, and apparently, for some unknown reason, the guard saw what was to come, or he just reacted instinctively, because in the next moment this disgusting female spat venom right into his face. He went down instantly. "And why was I never told that these creatures could hypnotize and spit poison?" shouted the king, now furious again. Someone must have noticed during the battles. In time, the King of Kings, much to his embarrassment, learned that not only was it the females alone who possessed this venom, but they had not even used it in battle, because they didn't find it necessary. The Syrians had been no match for the Aryan Air Force. But at this time the king didn't know that. 8.2 The second attacks. The greatly wounded reptilian prisoner of war died under interrogation, so the only prisoner left from the first attack on the Orion Empire was carefully tortured and interrogated. However, the Syrian king did not get much information from him either, except what the Orion prisoner volunteered without torture. He said that the Orion Empire is a peaceful empire and only goes to war if attacked. He added that the king should think carefully before he attacked again, because the queen could easily destroy the whole Syrian Empire. A much better option would be to sign a peace treaty with her and perhaps join the empire, abiding to its peaceful rules. The king just laughed at the suggestion, and when no one seemed to be able to get any more information out of the prisoner, he was left to the wolves, literally speaking. His body was eaten alive by a bloodthirsty audience. The next attack on the Orion Empire was even more ferocious than the first. The wolf and reptilian overlords fought on pure adrenaline, determined to make as much damage as possible. The Connor's hollowed-out planetoids showed up from nowhere in solar system after solar system belonging to the Orions, thinking they could take the worlds by surprise and conquer them to make their own empire stronger. However, the Orions always seemed to know where they were going to show up next and were waiting for them. The Syrians didn't stand a chance. Their asteroids and planetoids were shot to pieces by the Orion mighty war machinery, and after yet another defeat, the King of Kings had to withdraw again. For the first time during his long regime he felt weak and helpless. This was not good. Connor could never show weakness, or he'd be overthrown and killed, possibly by one of his own sons. So just to make sure, he sent his sons on missions far away from the Syrian throne, to solar systems many light years away, just to keep them busy enough not to attack him. He told his sons that they could descend to certain worlds and play around there as they pleased, something he knew they enjoyed. Playing around, however, was usually bad news for whomever lived on that planet. 8.3 The Peace Treaty. While the King of Kings was licking his wounds again, even more confused, furious, but also horrified for the first time in his life, the Orion Queen sat on her throne, pondering what was happening. Although it didn't seem like it to the Syrian king, the Syrians had made a great impact on Nekht. They were still no match for the mighty empire of Orion. The Makh warriors had utterly defeated the Syrians in 2 major attacks and hugely decreased their warrior population. However, the queen knew that the Syrians almost certainly would try again, so what should she do? Destroy their entire civilization? That could be done, but nowadays, she preferred peaceful solutions when at all possible. She didn't see them as a threat, but she wanted them away from Peshmetan, knowing that whomever had control over the most commonly used passageway through the Milky Way galaxy also had control over much of the galaxy itself. She did not want the 9th passageway to fall into the hands of the Syrian lords. No, she had a better idea. First of all, she admired the skills and bravery of the Syrians. They were not as greatly trained as her own soldiers, but they were very strong, stubborn, and at least as ferocious as her own troops. It would be a pity to let this race be destroyed, so why not have them not only join her empire, but also be offered to work as advanced guards for her empire? So the Orion Queen invited the King of Kings of the mighty Syrian overlords to the Orion court in Mintaka for a discussion, royalty to royalty. His own, and the safety of his guards, was guaranteed. The queen knew exactly how to talk the Connor, the foremost King of Kings, into this agreement. She told him how impressed she was by his war tactics and the bravery and strength of his warriors. His people were true Khaa warriors, she said, only comparable to the Aryans themselves. But she also showed them her own war machine in its fullest, without giving out any details of how it all worked. She didn't want them to be able to copy her weaponry. The Syrian king was very impressed and realized that the Aryans were way ahead of his own people, and that the Syrians could not match the military strength of the Orion queens. Then the queen started talking about the treaty. She suggested that the king and his men joined the Orion Empire in an alliance. If he and his people accepted, they would be given significant territories in the outskirts of Sector 9, get access to some major star routes, and the king's warriors would be granted the title the Queen's Advanced Guards. They would be her Dakh warriors. She also promised them free expansion of their own territories and continue doing as they pleased, so long as it did not get in the way of the Orion Empire itself, and they needed to stay away from Peshmergan. The Syrian Empire would also join forces with the Aryans, which would strengthen the Syrian status in the eyes of any future enemies. This last part was a compromise on the Queen's part. She knew she couldn't stop the Syrians from having their ways when came to conquering space, unless she wanted to terminate them. In exchange, the Queen demanded obedience and loyalty to the throne of the Queen. The Syrians would be obligated to execute her will, but on the other hand, the Syrian Empire would always have backup from Orion when needed, and they would fight side by side. SIRIUS and all its colonies would belong to the Orion Empire, but the Syrian kings were allowed to run their own empire as they wanted, if they followed the basic Aryans' laws and rules. Then they both sat silent for a while, and the Queen noticed the hesitation in the king's eyes, but she also noticed that he could see the advantage of an alliance. After a few additional moments of silence, the Queen gave the two punch lines. If the king accepted, she promised not to tell other star races how easily she defeated the Syrians, and she also promised not to terminate the Syrian Empire utterly and entirely with her superior weapons. The king's eyes froze. He knew that the Queen was serious, and moreover she was right. And last, but not the least, the Queen suggested some goodwill marriages between Orion and SIRIUS. She said that this would hopefully bring the two species together and show both the Syrians and the Aryans that there now was a bond between them. The great divine marriage would stand between the Queen and the King of Kings himself, him that Sitchin and others call Anu. In addition, she offered one of her daughters to Anu's son of true Syrian blood. The daughter became known as Ninlil, and Anu's son was the infamous Enlil. Additionally, the Queen wanted one daughter on each throne in the Syrian Empire, as each star system in the Syrian Empire had its own king. She wanted to make sure she had control over the situation and could get reports on what happened in every corner of the Syrian Empire at all times. The King of Kings would reign together with the Queen herself and would be allowed to become pretty independent so long as he followed the agreement and abided to Orion laws and policies. He and his people were also free to travel anywhere within the Orion Empire, and the Queen emphasized that all these marriages were just business deals, no more, no less. Her thoughts were that if she could keep an eye of the king, and her daughters could move to Sirius-occupied worlds and keep an eye on the ruling king and his often rebellious offspring and report back to her, she would have the situation pretty much under control. The kings and their royal offspring were also offered Esma to extend their longevity considerably. The queen's daughter would then become the queen of Sirius and Anu's son would become the Canis Connor, thus keeping Anu's title once it was time for him to take over after the old king. As part of the deal, however, was that no descendant of the throne of the King of Kings could ascend to wear the title unless he was born from a royal daughter of Orion. And all priestess daughters had to be given full status as family members in the Syrian royal courts. This was a guarantee for the queen that the kings would follow Orion policy and stick to the agreement. And for the kings it was a guarantee that no one could attack the Syrian Empire without getting assistance from Orion. She presented it as a win-win alliance, knowing that she would get the most ferocious and ruthless warriors in the galaxy as her advanced guards. After all, it was purely a business deal. The king was flattered by her admiration for his empire, and also felt that there was soundness in the queen's appraisal. And he couldn't deny that life extension was quite a tempting offer. Anu finally spoke. He had, according to Syrian tradition where men took as many wives they could handle, already a lot of women in his possession, and therefore had no moral problems going along with the plan. The queen had showed him earlier how the universe is feminine in nature and that she, the queen, was like an extension of the goddess, and therefore the heir of the universe. This was what finally had the king of Sirius make his decision. He figured that if he married the queen, he would be the heir of the universe as well, and the lord of the Khaa the void. And he had to admit that the Orion females were stunningly beautiful. He could never reach such high status on his own, and he knew it. He also liked the idea that his elite troops would be the advanced guards in the court of the mother, and that he got quite an attractive sector of the Milky Way galaxy to oversee. The Sirian king sat back in his chair. He was pleased and thought he got the better deal. The queen smiled too, knowing he was wrong. 9. The Seven Sisters. When we hear the term Seven Sisters, we often think about the Pleiadian star cluster. In Greek mythology, the Seven Sisters were companions of Artemis, which already there connects them to Orion. See previous paper, the Orion Empire. They were, according to the same mythology, daughters of the Titan Atlas and the sea nymph Pleione, where sea often refers to the universe of the mother goddess, the 96%. The seven sisters in the Pleiadian star system are, Maia, the eldest, Electra, Taygete, Alcyone, our central sun, Seleno, Sterope and Merope, who is the youngest, and wooed by Orion. She was said to become mortal and faded away. The constellation of Orion is still said to pursue the seven sisters across the night sky. The myth goes that it was Zeus, the ruler of the Greek gods, who immortalized the seven sisters and made them into a star cluster, which we still can enjoy today as the Pleiades in the night sky. Interestingly enough, according to Callimachus, the great Greek poet, critic, and scholar, the seven sisters were daughters of an Amazonian queen, and credited with inventing ritual dances and nighttime festivals. That would correspond pretty well with Aryan shamanism, as described in previous papers. In fact, the seven sisters were indeed the daughters of the Amazonian queen of Orion, and probably her firstborns. They were the ones who were appointed administrators of some of the conquered worlds in the Great Galactic Wars. The Pleiadian star cluster is in the constellation of Taurus, the bull. We discussed in an earlier paper how Orion with his club is chasing the bull, Taurus, but no such conflict is known in our mythology. However, we know from the Pleiadians, channeled by Barbara Marciniak, that the Pleiades have been rebellious on and off throughout cosmic history, and this may very well be why Orion is chasing her in an attempt to make her come to her senses. We know, from listening to the Pleiadians, that they are from our future, and are part of a living hell over in the Pleiades in the future time in which they are residing. This group of channels are supposedly a rebel group who is trying to steer things back to a more humane society in their own star systems. The Seven Sisters, and all other administrators of the different Aryan colonies, were headed by daughters of the Queen. In our folklore we call them the Titans. They have also had a great impact on human history in ways unknown to most people. As usual, when there are big secrets, the Sirian overlords have more than one finger in it. 10. Peace in Orion again sort of. With the peace treaty, the Orion Empire expanded again, both territorially and technologically. The Sirian lords had their own unique technology, which they now shared with the Aryans and vice versa, so the two empires merged their knowledge for the benefit of both. Sirius still remained the headquarters of the Sirian Empire, and their colonies, such as that of Alpha Draconis, remained colonies of the Sirians. To get a picture of how this works, we may look at the Orion Empire as planet Earth with all its different countries. Now let's say there was a queen and a king ruling over all the countries in the world, a type of one world government. Still, each country, star system, had its own rulers and was thus quite self-governed, although also answering to Orion's laws and regulations, business and trade etc., similar to the European Union. Sometimes each star system, country in our allegory, had their own colonies in other star systems as well, such as the Sirians having colonies in Alpha Draconis. So, when a star system joined the Orion Empire, they were still sovereign in most ways, except they had to follow the overall rules, quite like our own EU member countries. So the Sirian lords still minded their own business, but could any time be summoned to the Mother's court to serve as her advanced guards, when needed. Peace now reigned again in the Orion Empire kind of. The Sirians, who continued their conquest of space and expanded their own empire, were often at war with other star races, but the Aryans rarely participated, as there was no need. Also, at one point in time, an old, powerful enemy of the Orion Empire became a problem again and a short war broke out. The Sirians immediately came to Aryan assistance and Orion and Sirius fought side by side for the first, and perhaps the last time. Their joined forces were undefeatable. The ferocious Aryan elite warriors and the Sirian overlords with their hollowed-out craft fighting together were overpowering for any enemy, and this previously so powerful enemy of Orion was quickly defeated and the survivors gave up and has not, to my knowledge, bothered Orion again. The Orion-Sirian peace treaty seemed to work pretty well for both parties, from their perspective. However, the Orion Queen would learn the hard way that the Sirian overlords were not, when it really came down to it, to be trusted. 11. Some thoughts and thoughts aside. When people think of the Great Galactic Wars, they think of this abundance of star races involved in it, fighting each other, not just the few I've brought up here. Indeed, I've only mentioned two races by name, the Aryans and the Sirians. There was more than that going on, much more. I described some of it in Level I, and the paper I wrote on it, Genesis Paper Number 1, Human Origins and the Living Library, is telling a little bit more about the Lyran Wars etc. But there was more than that, even, and the reason I am not bringing it up in details, neither in Level I and here in Level 2 is that these wars are not directly involving, or leading up to, our own history of Earth. Level 2 has as its purpose to narrow down and pinpoint what happened from the beginning of this universe and all the way up to present time, in something that could, for simplicity, be called a timeline which led directly to the creation of mankind and our development as a species. The rest I have either left out, or not researched well enough to present it. But I think that researchers and experiencers, such as Anton Parks, has much of it down quite right, although some of the characters and places are mixed up. This is not necessarily disinformation, but are probably serious attempts to get it right. It is not easy, because it's a jungle to go through before we have some information that holds water. Mr. Parks is definitely a must-read with all this in mind, because between the lines of what he writes you can sense the true story. The English translation, with long excerpts, making it consistent, and interviews with Parks can be found here, http://www.zeitlin.net/endenchantment/secrets.html. Many of the wars in the universe in the early days were the war of the genders. This may seem odd to the reader, but this is a universal problem, which has led to much killing and suffering, and the Sirians have had a hand in almost all of them. Males have tried to find the secrets of the females, tortured them, and used them in the most horrific rituals to steal their power. The females, on the other hand, have often refused to give it to them. They even created their own languages that could not be spoken by males. It was called Eem and was kept as a well-hidden secret between female priestesses, so they could communicate their secrets with each other. The males had their own language, which was called Emenita but was spoken by females as well when they communicated with males. The females started the get back on the males, sometimes viciously, and wars broke out that terminated whole species to the last individual. There were times when the universe, at least in our sector, was not a very friendly place. Fortunately, this seems to have changed overall, although some wars are still raging out there. If the reader wants to know what's going on in the heavens, the easiest way to find out, without even having to do much research, is to see what is happening down here on Earth and translate it, as above, so below. Other than that, most wars have been about real estate. Each planet is looked at as real estate, and creator gods or conquerors who come there first own the star system. If they are ethical creator gods, they first ask for permission to create in a particular star system, but a star race on a conquest doesn't always bother, or doesn't yet know the universal laws, because they did things out of order. We are meant to become a peaceful, wise race before we start reaching for the stars, and learn how to create without harm to others, but not all species have the patience to wait that long, or their development as a star race is such that they become warrior-like spacefarers instead.